24 coordinators in 18 months. The last one walked off the 38th floor of Vantara Tower at 7:52 on a Tuesday morning. Box in her arms, chin forward, eyes straight ahead, and not a single person in the open office turned to watch her go. They didn't have to. They had memorized the walk by now. Somewhere behind the supply room printer, folded twice and held flat by a binder clip, lived a sheet of paper that management had never officially acknowledged. It tracked names, dates, and numbers. How many days each coordinator had lasted before the corner office reached the end of its patience. The record was 43 days. Most didn't reach 20. And into that building, where the math was already written against him, walked Tobias Renner, 47 years old, $12 in his checking account, and a daughter who had asked him that morning whether this new job meant they could stop eating cereal for dinner twice a week. He told her what he believed to be true, which was that he hoped so. The woman from HR met him at the elevator and skipped the usual orientation pleasantries. She told him plainly that the role had consumed more people than she cared to count, that the company's chief executive had a standard no ordinary person had yet managed to meet, and that he should keep his expectations conservative and his references current. Then she lowered her voice as though the floor itself might carry it. Before her father died, she said, she was different. That's all I'll say. Tobias nodded and did not ask for more. Office mythology had never interested him. What interested him was the salary, specific, substantial, enough to cover the rent and Alice's school supplies and the car payment that had been 30 days late for 2 months running. He had spent 20 years as an aerospace systems engineer, building precision components for aircraft that could not tolerate error at 30,000 feet. Then, the defense contract his division depended on was canceled, the division dissolved, and he spent 8 months stitching together freelance work while his daughter ate cereal twice a week and pretended not to notice the worry he couldn't quite keep off his face. His wife Elena had died 3 years before that, from an illness that moved faster than anyone expected, and since then it had been the two of them, him and Alice, 10 years old now, sharp-eyed and forgiving in the way only children can be. She had asked him the previous night, while he ironed his best shirt at the kitchen table, why he pressed clothes instead of just pulling them from the dryer. He told her it was because details mattered when you were walking into a room where someone was deciding whether to trust you. She thought about it and said, "Like when I check my math twice before turning in a test?" He said exactly like that. She seemed satisfied, and he finished the shirt, and neither of them mentioned that it was the only one he owned without a frayed cuff. He needed this job. The building's history could stay with the building. The corner office was cooler than the rest of the floor, and Miriam Stahl did not look up when Tobias entered. She was 41, precise and contained, the daughter of the man who had founded Vantara Medical Systems in a rented lab with 2 employees and built it into one of the country's leading cardiac monitoring device manufacturers before a stroke took him at 63. She had inherited the company at 38, and 2 months after burying her father, she watched her co-founder Philip Sutter file their shared core algorithm under his own name, while she was still sorting through the estate. The legal battle lasted 2 years. She won. She never recovered what had mattered more: the belief that closeness was safe. She slid a stack of regulatory timelines across the desk without looking up. "I don't need someone who works hard," she said. "I need someone who doesn't make mistakes." Tobias set the folder he'd brought alongside her stack. "Then we already want the same thing," he said. Something in the steadiness of his voice made her pause for half a second before she moved on. She had heard steady before. She had watched it dissolve, so she tested him the way she tested everyone, without warning, without paper, without mercy. She recited her schedule aloud, fast and flat. 11 meetings, 2 FDA correspondence deadlines, a teleconference with a European regulatory body that required GMT time conversion, a board presentation on Thursday, and a manufacturing compliance audit scheduled to overlap with that presentation by 40 minutes. She stopped and folded her hands. How much of that did you retain? Tobias gave it back to her in sequence. All of it, including the GMT offset and the 40-minute conflict, which he noted would need to be resolved before Thursday. For the first time, Miriam Stahl looked at him for longer than a passing moment. She did not compliment him. She simply said, as he gathered the timelines to leave, 24 people before you all thought they were equal to this. Tobias paused at the door and turned back without hurry. I'm not here to impress you, he said. I'm here because the work matters. Then he sat down at the desk that had held 24 careers in 18 months, opened his folder, and ished in things as though he planned to stay. The problem revealed itself before lunch, and it was not the kind of problem that announced itself. Tobias had spent 2 decades in environments where a single miscalibrated component could compromise an entire system, and he had learned to read the difference between organic disorder and engineered failure. What he found on the 38th floor followed a pattern too neat for chaos. 2 critical meetings sat back-to-back in buildings on opposite ends of downtown Chicago. Regulatory attachments arrived in the document management system with their final pages missing. Always the pages containing the technical specifications the FDA would reference. Calendar invites were quietly updated with incorrect dial-in codes an hour before calls were set to begin. Tobias sat with this and did the arithmetic quietly, the way he had once traced a vibration signature back to a single loose fitting in an engine assembly. 24 people could not all have made the same mistake, in the same place at the same moment. People failed in their own ways, on their own timelines. A recurring pattern across 24 careers was not coincidence. It was architecture. So instead of racing to clear the morning backlog, he began tracing the document management system. Vantara used a platform called MedDocs, mandatory for all regulated submissions, following each file from origin to destination, noting who touched it and when. He said nothing to anyone. He simply watched. By mid-morning, he had mapped how documents actually moved on the 38th floor, and the map looked less like a workflow than a maze, with gates that only opened one way. Files didn't travel directly from creators to the people who needed them. They passed through intermediary steps, reassigned, copied, rerouted, and at each junction, a file could be delayed or stripped of an attachment, and the audit trail would point not at the intermediary but at the coordinator who failed to catch the discrepancy. The design was elegant in a way Tobias recognized from failure analysis reports. A clearly authored mistake gets its author fired. A mistake with no clear author gets whoever is standing closest to the chief executive fired, again and again, indefinitely. And the person standing closest, by design, was always the newest coordinator. He wrote that down in the front of the navy blue field notebook he'd carried since his engineering days, graph paper pages, spiral-bound, the kind that survived job sites and cold mornings and shirt pockets, and he kept writing. The first real test came before noon. Miriam had a call with Vantara's largest hospital network partner, a relationship worth $90 million annually, and the call required full compliance briefing from the shared MedDocs server. 12 minutes before the call, the document set was gone. Not misfiled. Gone. At precisely that moment, Roland Fitch appeared in the doorway. 46 years old, Chief Operating Officer, 6 years at Vantara. He was impeccably dressed and soft-spoken, and he carried the specific kind of dangerous calm that came from a man who understood power well enough never to flaunt it. He glanced at Tobias with a pleasant, measured smile. "The new coordinator seems to be settling in," he said, and let the silence that followed do its work. Every head close enough to hear turned. Everyone waited for number 25 to do what the others had done: panic, scramble, confirm the verdict that had already been written about him. Tobias did not panic. He remembered seeing the document set referenced in a distribution email from 3 weeks prior, forwarded internally as part of an FDA correspondence chain. He followed that thread backward through the email archive with the patience of someone who trusted his memory over his anxiety. And in 11 minutes he located the entire briefing, sitting untouched, in a compliance archive subfolder, technically outside the primary MedDocs tree, but technically intact. He had it open on Miriam's screen before the hospital network partner dialed in. The call went forward. Roland's smile didn't falter, but something behind it cooled, and he left without another word. Miriam said nothing to Tobias about it, which, he was beginning to understand, was her particular way of registering that something had gone right. He noticed other things too. She ran on caffeine and forward momentum from before 8 in the morning until past 9 at night, and she almost never ate during the day. So on his second morning, without being asked, he set a protein bar at the corner of her desk. Miriam looked at it the way she looked at everything unexpected, with controlled suspicion. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "No," Tobias answered, already back at his screen, "but your schedule doesn't have a lunch in it." She pushed it toward the edge of her desk with the clear intention of throwing it away. By 4 in the afternoon, the wrapper was in her trash can. Neither of them mentioned it then or afterward, and that small unspoken exchange became its own quiet agreement between them. The coordinated pressure from the floor came next. Senior staff routed him assignments outside his role, then reversed those assignments before he could complete them, then attached deadlines that were physically impossible to meet. Augusta Thorne, a board member from one of Chicago's founding families, cornered him in a conference room and looked him over the way someone inspects a chair they aren't certain belongs in the room. Her gaze moved from his shoes to his collar to the slight wear at his cuffs. "And which placement service sent you?" she asked, in a voice calibrated to be overheard. Tobias named the agency without apology. Augusta gave a small, polished laugh. Vantara used to recruit from MIT. The translation was not complicated. He didn't belong here, and she intended to make sure the room understood it. After that, the pressure came from every direction. Tobias met it the same way every time, calmly, without argument, without reacting to the performance of it. When an impossible assignment landed on his desk, he confirmed it in writing, noted the time and the name of the person who gave it, and completed exactly what had been asked. When the trap sprang, there was nothing inside it but a clean record of him doing his job. The navy blue notebook filled steadily, dates, times, names, which document had gone missing and when, who had last accessed it in MedDocs, who had called a meeting that required a file that then wasn't where it was supposed to be. He wasn't trying to catch anyone. He was making certain that in a building where things disappeared, at least one record would stay intact. Word began moving through the floor, slowly, that coordinator number 25 was harder to trip than the others, that trying to trip him was beginning to carry its own risks. Miriam kept testing him independently. One evening, 20 minutes before 9, when the floor had emptied and the cleaning crew hadn't arrived yet, she appeared at his desk and told him she wanted the Thursday board presentation rebuilt from the ground up, different structure, different data framing, and she wanted both a 12-page executive version and a 40-page technical version. Any reasonable person would have named the hour. Tobias only asked which version should lead in the master file. Miriam told him to use his judgment. He nodded. Then, before she turned back toward her office, he said something quietly that stopped her. "Thursday morning, I'll arrive by 9:15 instead of 8. Alice has a winter concert Wednesday night, and I drop her at school on concert mornings." The temperature in the room dropped precisely 2 degrees. Miriam turned back fully. "This company," she said, spacing each word, "does not reorganize itself around an employee's personal schedule." Tobias met her eyes without raising his voice. "Then you'll be looking for coordinator number 25, he said. I'll have everything on your desk by 7 a.m. Thursday regardless. It was the first time in 18 months that someone on the other side of that interaction had drawn a line and refused to move it. The first time anyone had named something outside those walls as equal in value to what was inside them. Miriam looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone recalibrating a measurement they had taken wrong. 9:15, she said at last. 9:15, Tobias confirmed. The matter was settled on his terms, which unsettled her in a way she didn't immediately understand. By the end of his third week, the pattern he had been assembling began to resolve into something he could almost prove. He started with a question that had been bothering him since his first morning. Were all 24 of his predecessors actually bad at their jobs? He pulled what personnel records he could access and read them slowly without assumption. The answer surprised him. Several had been genuinely excellent. One had managed logistics for a network of hospital systems. Another had a regulatory affairs background that should have made her nearly impossible to trip up on compliance issues. These were not careless people. These were people who had all failed in the same building, in the same role, in the same specific ways. One file stayed with him. A woman named Frances Albright had held the coordinator position for 38 days, second longest on the list, and by any measure should have been successful. She had come from a congressional office, where she had managed scheduling and regulatory correspondence for a sitting senator. Her letters of reference described her as meticulous, unflappable, incapable of overlooking a detail. The document that ended her career described a single catastrophic failure, a 51010 submission packet delivered to the FDA without its critical technical appendix, attributed entirely to her carelessness. Tobias found the original MedDocs version log buried 4 folders deep. When he compared the metadata, he saw that the appendix had been stripped from the file after Frances submitted it into the workflow. Not before, in a version that passed through an intermediate step whose access record had been partially scrubbed. She had done everything correctly. The failure that had followed her out of that building, that had trailed her into the next job and the one after, had never been hers. He sat with that for a long time because it told him 2 things at once. The sabotage was deliberate and systematic, and the people it had destroyed would never know they had been innocent. So he mapped what happened in the days just before each coordinator's termination and laid end to end the shape emerged. Each dismissal was preceded by the same sequence: a document going missing, a meeting silently rescheduled to the wrong time, an email Miriam needed failing to reach her. And each time, the first person to surface the error, to name it, to point toward the coordinator as the cause, was Roland Fitch. No single incident was enough to prove anything. Everyone could be explained as coincidence. But 24 incidents, stacked and dated, was not coincidence. It was a structure. Tobias closed the blue notebook and sat with what he understood. The rest came from Rupert Gilmore, who found Tobias alone in a conference room one evening and, in the deliberate manner of a man who had been waiting for the right moment, told him about Arthur Stahl. Miriam's father had built Vantara on a specific operating philosophy. Trust was not given, but once earned, it was absolute. He had trusted Philip Sutter with everything, and Philip Sutter had taken everything he could carry. After that, the woman who inherited the company began changing in ways her father had not intended. In her first 2 years running Vantara alone, Miriam had discovered that a trusted department head had been selling operational data to a competitor, that a supplier she'd relied on for years had been double billing, that a contractor with full facility access had copied proprietary testing protocols on the way out. She didn't become cold, Rupert said quietly. She became armored. There's a difference, even when it looks the same from outside. The revolving door was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a woman who had decided, after enough wounds, that the safest distance between herself and the next betrayal was the length of time it took to trust someone. 24 dismissals were not 24 failures. They were 24 preemptive retreats by a person who had concluded that trust itself was the vulnerability. Understanding that changed how Tobias approached everything that came after. One evening, later than he should have stayed, Miriam came out of her office and found him at his desk and seemed for a moment genuinely puzzled by it. "You have a daughter at home," she said. It wasn't a reprimand. It was closer to a question. Tobias looked up from the report he was closing out. "That's exactly why I'm finishing this now," he said, "so I can go home to her." Miriam stood in the doorway a moment longer than she'd intended. She had built her world so that the company was the entirety of it. He was the first person in a long time to treat work as the thing that served a life, rather than the other way around. There was an afternoon she did not forget. A late meeting had run well past 5, and his phone had buzzed twice on the desk, and when he finally glanced at it, something moved across his face before he smoothed it away and kept working. She asked what was wrong. He told her, after a moment, that Alice had a fever. Nothing serious, a neighbor was with her, but that he didn't like being the last to know. Miriam looked at the stack of materials still between them, and then she did something that surprised them both. She told him to go. Not as a favor, she said, as a practical matter. A man worried about his child would do the work badly anyway, and she preferred it done well in the morning. Tobias studied her face for a second to determine whether it was a test. It was not. He gathered his coat and left, and the next morning the materials were on her desk before she arrived, completed exactly as she would have done them herself. Neither of them mentioned that evening, but something between them had quietly recalibrated. What Tobias found in the IT access logs that week required him to sit very still for a long moment before he moved on. He had been tracing a misdirected email thread when he found something that should not have been there. A cluster of Miriam's emails, specific ones, tied to vendor contracts and budget authorizations, had been silently forwarded to a secondary internal address before reaching her. He traced the address. It resolved to a service account registered under a name he recognized, R. Fitch. The forwarding had been established over a year ago. The access had been scrubbed recently enough that its absence was itself a record. Tobias closed the log file, memorized what he had seen, and understood that he had stepped into something much larger than a difficult job. He felt the ground shift under him in the days that followed. He could tell, in the way someone who has spent years calibrating systems can tell when something is out of tolerance, that he was being watched back, that whoever had engineered the last 24 dismissals understood that the 25th had lasted too long and looked too carefully. The move came on the morning Vantara was preparing to submit its most significant FDA filing in 3 years, a 510N application for a next-generation cardiac monitoring patch. 6 years in development, $240 million in projected revenue. At 6:22 a.m., while Tobias was driving Alice to school, a confidential pre-submission draft of the application was transmitted to a competitor's regulatory affairs address. The system logged it as originating from Tobias's workstation. The frame was precise. 6:22 was before anyone else arrived, after his credentials had been active on the system since the previous evening. There was no witness to place him elsewhere. The log showed his account, his workstation, his session ID. To anyone reading the record, it was finished before it started. Roland Fitch was careful not to appear pleased when the emergency board session convened that afternoon. Augusta Thorne made no such effort. "Remove him immediately," she said, before the door was fully closed, before the FDA is notified and this becomes a public matter. The board assembled around the long conference table, and every face turned to Miriam. This was the moment that had ended 24 careers before his. The evidence arranged, the crowd already decided, the outcome assumed. Tobias stood at the far end of the table and placed the navy blue notebook on the polished surface with a quiet, deliberate sound. "If you believe I did this," he said, Then let the decision be yours. But look at the data first. Miriam looked at him across the length of the table. Her voice was composed. You're not denying it. I'm telling you to look before you conclude, he said. Roland sighed with the patience of a reasonable man tolerating an inconvenience. How very careful of him, he said softly, and left the implication to work on its own. Everything in Miriam Stahl's history, every lesson absorbed across 6 years of being betrayed by people who sat exactly where Tobias was sitting, pointed toward one answer. The room was waiting for it. Augusta was already composing the follow-up motion. Miriam looked at Tobias Renner for a long time. She looked at the man who had drawn a line about a school concert and not moved it, who had left early for a sick child and returned with everything finished before sunrise, who had told her on his first morning that he was there because the work mattered, who had never, in 3 weeks, repeated a thing he'd overheard, returned a gift a vendor pressed on him, or taken credit for solving a problem someone else had caused. In a building where everyone was always performing for someone, he simply was what he appeared to be. And after 18 months of watching people perform, Miriam found that quality almost disorienting. She turned toward the door and said, in a tone that sealed the room, "No one leaves this floor." The silence that followed was the most complete the conference room had ever held. Tobias opened the notebook and laid the record out in sequence. 3 weeks of observations, dated and timed, each incident mapped against the MedDoc system access logs and the internal email routing records he had archived. The pattern he described was not an accusation. It was arithmetic. Every irregularity resolved against the same account activity, same timing, same mechanism, same intermediate step. Rupert Gilmore listened without expression, then quietly instructed the IT security team to pull the full access logs without filtering, all the way to the hardware level. What they found was unambiguous. A secondary device, not registered to Tobias, registered under a name that traced to a service contract in Roland's department, had been accessing Tobias's workstation remotely through an unpatched gap in the building's internal network. The 6:22 a.m. transmission had been sent from Roland Fitch's reach, wearing Tobias Renner's identity like a borrowed keycard. Roland's composure showed its first crack. His voice came back half a beat too fast. The IT team, once given authorization to stop being polite about scope, kept pulling threads. The secondary device had accessed not just Tobias's account, but the accounts of former coordinators, at precisely the moments those coordinators had supposedly failed. 38 days of Francis Albright's career disassembled from inside. They found that administrator permissions on the MedDocs server had been altered dozens of times through a service account that traced to Roland's executive assistant. A young man who, when interviewed, admitted almost immediately that he had been told the changes were routine maintenance approved from above. Piece by piece, 18 months of coordinated sabotage came apart on the table, and none of it led back to Tobias Renner. All of it led to the same office, the same name, the same patient design. Then Rupert Gilmore said something that changed the weight of everything already said. In the months before his stroke, Arthur Stahl had noticed anomalies in the vendor payment records. Maintenance contracts for equipment that didn't appear in the facility's asset inventory, recurring billing from suppliers no department head could verify. He had told Rupert he was going to investigate. He died before he could. The anomalies had continued for 18 months after his death. The total, when the forensic accounting team was authorized to look, was $9.2 million, routed through a chain of vendor entities that traced back to a holding company connected to the Fitch family. Roland had not been managing the 38th floor. He had been managing the distance between Miriam and anyone who might look at a line item twice. 24 coordinators had been 24 layers of insulation between the chief executive and the man who had been robbing her company. Tobias had simply been the first to stay calm long enough to count the layers. Roland made one final attempt to address the room as an equal. He straightened, summoned the old authority, and said, "Are you genuinely prepared to accept the word of a coordinator hired 3 weeks ago over the chief operating officer who has served this company for 6 years?" Tobias answered him in 5 words, without heat and without triumph. "Let the data answer." The notebook lay open on the table, the IT logs beside it, the financial trail beneath that. There was nothing left for Roland Fitch's composure to hold on to. The room that had assembled to terminate Tobias Renner had instead watched him quietly dismantle the man who ran its operations. The internal investigation took 11 days and confirmed every element. When the moment came, Miriam Stahl did not raise her voice. She did not make Roland's exit a performance. She set a sealed envelope on his desk and said 4 words, "Your employment ends today." Roland looked at Tobias, standing quietly to the side, and something bitter moved across his face. "All of this," he said, "because of a coordinator." Miriam let the silence run. "No," she said at last, "because I finally paid attention to someone." Roland had nothing for that. He picked up his coat and walked out, and the door closed on 6 years of careful theft. Augusta Thorne, who had staked her credibility loudly on Tobias's guilt, was asked by the remaining board to step back from the audit committee. Her judgment considered compromised where it counted most. The thing that surprised the floor came afterward, when Tobias walked into Miriam's office and proposed something she hadn't anticipated. He asked her to reach back to the 24 coordinators who had come before him. Not to rehire them, he said. Most had rebuilt their lives and wouldn't want to return. But the ones who had carried a failure that was never theirs deserved to know the truth. A corrected personnel file, an honest letter to replace the one that had followed them out the door. Miriam studied him across her desk. "You want me to personally contact 24 people. You don't need them to forgive you," Tobias said, "but they deserve to know what actually happened." Something in her shifted. A final piece of the armor, finding for the first time that it had no weight left to carry. She had spent 18 months protecting herself from other people. He was asking her to spend her time protecting other people from what she had allowed to happen. It was the largest step she had ever taken away from the woman who had inherited her father's empire along with her father's wound. She made the calls. Not all of them were easy. Francis Albright was the third. The call started carefully on both ends, wary, neither of them moving first. Miriam found that saying the words aloud, admitting plainly that Francis had done nothing wrong, that she had been failed by the institution that fired her, cost more than any negotiation she had conducted in 6 years. Francis was quiet for a while on the other end of the line. She had spent, she finally said, almost a year believing she had simply broken under pressure, questioning every judgment call in the job she'd taken afterward, carrying a verdict that had never been true. She didn't need to come back, and she wouldn't. But knowing the truth, she said, felt like putting down something heavy she hadn't realized she was still holding. When Miriam set the phone down, she sat with her hand resting on it for a long moment. Tobias, passing in the hallway, saw something on her face he hadn't seen there before. Not relief and not triumph, but the particular expression of someone beginning to grieve for the person they had been. 3 months later, the 38th floor of Vantara Tower was visibly different. Miriam Stahl was still exacting, still capable of freezing a meeting with a single measured pause, still impossible to satisfy when the work fell short. But she had stopped running the company on managed fear, and the floor that had braced itself every Monday morning had started, cautiously, to breathe again. It was in this changed atmosphere that she offered Tobias a new contract, chief of staff to the chief executive, more authority, a title that reflected what the role had actually become since the day he sat down at that desk and arranged his things as though he planned to stay. She slid the papers across to him with the directness he'd come to know. "You're not a coordinator anymore," she said. Tobias looked down at the contract, and the corner of his mouth moved. "So you're finally letting me go after all." Miriam looked at him with the expression she reserved for things that surprised her. "Promoting you," she said. He signed. Before he stood to leave, she asked him the question she had apparently been holding since his first morning. "You told me that first day you were the last coordinator I would ever need. Did you actually believe that?" Tobias set the pen down. "No," he said. Her eyebrow rose. He met her eyes evenly. "I only knew that if you fired me, I wasn't going to let you walk away thinking it was my fault." For the first time since he had walked through her door, Miriam Stahl laughed. A real one, short and genuine, startled out of her before she could compose it away. "Fair enough," she said. When he had gone, she sat looking at the desk beyond her office door. The chair that had held 24 faces in 18 months. Each one arrived, and calibrated and braced, and gone before anything between them could mean anything. The chair was empty now, not because she had cleared it, but because the man who had claimed it had become the first person in years she genuinely trusted. And trust, she was slowly relearning, did not need to be replaced every few weeks. It only needed to be given once to the right person, and then kept. Some days after that, passing the supply room, Tobias noticed the sheet still held behind the printer, its heading worn but readable. "How many days for 25?" Beneath the column of names and numbers, someone had written a new line in a hand he didn't recognize. "Still here. Check back never." He took a pen from his shirt pocket and crossed out the number assigned to his name. In the space beside it, he wrote something truer. Tobias Renner, permanent. He was capping the pen when he registered that Miriam was standing 2 feet behind him, having arrived, as always, without a sound. She read the sheet over his shoulder, and her expression settled into its familiar composed line. "Defacing supply room property," she said, "is a terminable offense at this company." Tobias didn't turn around. "Are you going to fire me?" Miriam started back toward her office at a measured pace. "Don't test me." He watched her go, and because he had learned by now exactly how far he could push it, he said, "I thought careful testing was the whole reason I was hired." She stopped. She turned. She gave him the look that had emptied that desk 24 times. But underneath it, plainly, unmistakably, was the smile she wasn't quite fast enough to hide. And on the 38th floor of Vantara Tower, for the first time in 18 months, the chair stayed filled.